Everyone. Today is going to be another guided practice for how to do a visual argument evaluation analysis. On the screen in front of you, you see an advertisement, and here's what it says. Demonstrations in lightness. This chunk of heavy metal is a scale pounding 1001 grams. No hope against the Derby Blues Mini like 320 grams. Fair? Not really. But doesn't that car look cool with those shoes? Using super light outsoles, we make shoes lighter than muscle cars. No polish required. See more demonstrations in lightness at rollynation.com. Okay, so let's talk about this thing. Again, remember that there are 4 criteria that you're going to be evaluating your advertisements with. There is the use of type, the use of space, the use of color, and the use of image. So let's talk about the use of type first. I always like to start with that one. Honestly, you could start with any that you like. I just think starting with the use of type tends to lend itself better to the overall building of the different elements. I think all the other elements kind of play off the use of type. So I start with that one, but you do you. So anyway, here we go. So it says demonstrations, in lightness. And it looks like the entire thing up here is in a sans serif font. Now remember, sans serif literally means without those little hooks. Again, why is that important? Well, typically for longer pieces of writing, you want that serif font because it helps your eyes adjust. It helps you to read it better. When it's not a lot of writing, you can get away with this sans serif font. Plus, if you're looking at the formality of it, a sans serif font is much more informal. This demonstrates, or this denotes, a much more informal type of idea or message. And I think that's what they're going for here. This is not a very formal message. It does border on a bit too much, I guess, maybe. That's debatable. Here's my issue with the type. And you might have noticed when I was reading it that I was struggling a little bit. I was inching forward. I was struggling a little bit. Part of that's because I'm old. But the other part of that is it's just not a good font. I mean, this is way too small. This is fine, but this is way too small and way too light. And we'll get more into that when we talk about the use of color. But this is very hard to read. Not only that, but is it really necessary? Is the message really necessary? Why are we debating the weight of a pair of shoes to the weight of a car? I don't get it. So to me, this analogy doesn't make any sense, and it's really hard to read because it's so small and it's a terrible color given the background. So this is fine, but again, the whole message, it's just, I mean, why? So hopefully that makes sense. Personally, I think that's pretty poor. I would rate the use of type as very ineffective. You have the company brand down here, which is nice. You know, it's down here, it's bright red, it's got their decorative font. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. But I mean, this is just bad. Just bad. So anyway, let's talk about the use of space then. And here's another really big negative. Why? Why is there so much space here and here? This ad is huge. If I made this full screen, if I were to make this full screen, I'm not going to because I'm just not. But if I were going to make this full screen, I would have to actually scroll to see the whole thing. it is really unnecessary to make this that long. This space is too much. This space is too much. Now, I will say that as far as the framing of it goes, this is framed nicely in the shot. Remember the rule of thirds. So if I were to divide this monstrosity into a grid, 3 by 3 grid, you'd have a line here, a line here, a line here, and a line here. This is on that bottom line. So as far as that goes, this is placed nicely. This is formatted nicely. And both the shoes and the car are on these lines. So I have no problem with the image, other than the fact that the entire message just doesn't make any sense to me. But this is way too high up here. This is distractingly way too high up here. And then your eyes have to scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll to get to here. That's ridiculous. And then why? Just why? Why is there so much empty space here? So again, really poor. Not as poor as the use of type, in my opinion. I'm trying to find a silver lining. This use of type is nice. This is not. This use of spacing is nice. The rest of this is not. So again, I would say ineffective. The use of color. Again, another problem. I do like the background. This is nice and clean. This is nice and clean. The blue on the shoes matches the blue on the car nicely. The color of the wood matches nicely with the blue on the car and the shoes. So I have no problem with that. Where I do have a problem with the use of color. Oh, and this red really pops down here. So again, I have no problem with the use of color with any of that. Where I do have a problem is up here. This is ridiculously hard to read. It's too small, and it's this really bright blue on a gray background. It just, why? I mean, there needs to be more, I guess, contrast between the color here and the background color. And then, plus, not only is this so small, but it's getting closer to the brighter part of the gray where it's kind of illuminated. So it's really hard to read with that color choice. I would call the use of space. I range somewhere between somewhat effective and ineffective. Sorry, the use of color. We already talked about use of space. Use of space, again, yeah, I lean closer to ineffective. Use of color, I would call this somewhat effective at best. Again, I like the use of color down here. This, not so much. Now let's talk about the use of image. Now, the use of image is probably where this thing shines. This is really clean. This is really nice. It's framed nicely. It's very clear that based on the writing, what this is supposed to be depicting, the lightness of the shoes. But again, going back to my use of font or my use of type, I don't get the point. Why do we need to compare the weight of shoes to the weight of a car? Maybe I'm just being dense. I don't know, but I don't get it. So, all of those things considered, I would call this thing overall ineffective. Okay, so when you're doing this, you're going to have an activity coming up shortly where you're going to have to do what I've been doing on these guided practices. The first thing you're going to need to do is identify what was the point of the advertisement. For this, I guess, and this is where I have a big problem with this whole thing, is I don't really get the point of this ad. I would guess the point is that they're just trying to show how lightweight their shoes are, which, okay, but why compare it to a car? Why not compare it to another shoe? That seems to me like a false analogy, to go back to our logical fallacy lessons. The rest of it is borderline okay to not so good. There's nothing in here that's just stands out as great. So at best, you could say that this ad is somewhat effective, but I lean overall closer to ineffective. So start with the author's point, talk about the four different criteria, and then give an overall. Overall, this is what based on the four criteria. And that's it.